What caught my attention this weekend was how privileged certain people think they are because they're white and they have money. They believe they can say and do anything they goddamn well please. Now, why would I even say that? Well, there's been some media reports detailing how the Orange Felon Liar has made overtures of offering white Afrikaners, that is, white South Africans of Dutch and British heritage, and who were the ruling class during the country's apartheid era, a rapid pathway to citizenship in the United States because what he believes they've been treated terribly by the current South African government. Concurrently, there was a media report about how the Nazi saluting apartheid baby is complaining that he's not being allowed to operate his satellite business, Starlink, in his native South Africa because he's not black. Because with the current administration's white Christian nationalist ideology, propaganda, and policies, the Orange Felon Liar has ordered, upon taking office back in January, that all foreign aid to South Africa be cut off. Now, I'll get into the details and history of these, but I do want to point out how his supporters are on board with their complaints and bloviations, which, of course, are all kinds of distortion, lies, and racist talk. One person, the infamous Laura Loomer, said white genocide is happening in South Africa, but that she's fine with it so long as the current administration does a better job at deporting the people that he's promised to deport. Brooke Rollins, current Secretary of Agriculture, went on to say that the white Afrikaners are the kind of immigrant that this country needs. The strong tradition of South African agriculture, ranching, and conservation goes back centuries and reflects, above all else, the Afrikaner devotion to land heritage, she says. Says the Nazi saluting apartheid baby. Thankfully, this administration cares about all people. Now, here's the details and history. There's a generation now going to two generations of people who may not know about South Africa's history of colonization and apartheid, which was its version of history of segregation that's known in the United States. Segregation, Jim Crow, that's known in the United States. Dutch and British colonizers, who always numbered in the ethnic minority, owned a vast percentage of land and natural resources, and of course, they controlled the country's wealth. South Africa, for those who don't know, is known for its diamond mines, among other things. The oppression of native South African blacks had existed for centuries. The practice of apartheid became a form of government rule in 1948 by separating the races. In other words, keeping people apart by racial and ethnic groups. The enforcement of these laws were infamously done by violence. Notably, black South Africans had to have actual certain papers that allowed them movement from one place to another in South Africa. Famously, Nelson Mandela was among many who resisted. He spent decades in prison, which he was released in February 1990. By then, South Africa had become an international pariah, and the Afrikaners, who were then headed by F.W. de Klerk, gave in to international and social economic pressure. South Africa is no longer under apartheid rule, and its government, which has been black ruled since the early 1990s, has taken small steps and measures to reallocate the land and wealth back to its rightful people. It's an attempt at righting historic wrongs. It's a kind to United States Supreme Court decisions that were rendered that initiated a more level playing field, i.e., Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and other pieces of legislation and executive orders that ensued in the immediate years. So here are the issues. Back in January, South African leader Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law a policy that would speed up the process of redistributing private land by the government over to blacks, but it gave specifics on how it can or cannot be done. The term used is expropriation. You might want to call it, in United States terms, reparations. The formal piece of legislation was the Expropriation Act, 13 of 2024. It was constructed to be in line with the country's constitution. Now, upon taking power back in 1994, the African National Congress stated goal was redistributing 30% of agricultural land back to Black South Africans by roughly the year 2000. They said within 5 years, but let's just say the year 2000. That goal is not yet met. It is estimated that maybe 17% of the land has been redistributed from white landowners to the state or government or Black owners. So now the stated goal is to see that redistributed land back to Blacks by up to 30% by the year 2030. For the Black South Africans, this is something that is taking too long to formulate and execute. For the Afrikaners, they feel this is unconstitutional. Now, you're talking about, now, for the folk who feel that this is unconstitutional, you're talking about a group of people who comes to a country, take the people's land and its possessions, and then the people who were there originally are relegated to an inferior class, although they are in the majority according to population. Sounds familiar? One noted South African legal scholar said the biggest losers of the colonial and apartheid periods in South Africa history were the Black South Africans, who, along with loss of land, lost their livelihoods and, more importantly, livestock. In other words, and historically speaking, livestock for the native Black South Africans was a sign of wealth. So here's where the Orange Felon Liar enters into this discourse. This is also an example how U.S. foreign policy attempts to dictate a certain narrative. Now, personally speaking, I've come to acknowledge my ignorance of U.S. foreign policy, and for that matter, its policy on foreign aid and how it's been used as a means of accomplishing a similar goal without the sheer use of military. Foreign aid, in some measures, is a veiled attempt to set up resistant movements, establish media-based narratives, and dictate that country's policies that become in the interest of the United States, all in the name of supposedly helping the disadvantaged. So the Orange Felon Liar comes outright and says he's cutting off all foreign aid to South Africa because of the country's effort at righting historical wrongs through land expropriation. According to media reports, about $440 million in foreign aid was allocated to South Africa in 2023. About $318 million was provided to South Africa in the fiscal year ending in 2024. So that would be what? It's either one or two dates, either by the end of September 2024 or December 31st, 2024. Says the Orange Felon Liar, certain classes of people were being treated very badly. Now, that's what one set of media reports I've seen saying, but what I did not see was the entirety of the quote in Western media, but this was what the Orange Felon Liar had said. South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It is a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation at a minimum is happening for all to see. I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until a full investigation of this situation has been completed. This was in response to South Africa's policy that's making it easier for its government to redistribute land in the public's interest so long as it's equitable in compensation. The legislation spelled out specific instances in which white landowners would not be compensated. South Africa is also one of the founding countries in the Chinese-Russian-backed BRICS, whose rival is the G7. BRICS, in its acronym, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it's clear that the Orange Felon Liar is supporting white interests abroad, more specifically, white supremacy anywhere and everywhere. This is not the first time that a U.S. president was on the wrong side of the argument involving South Africa. Back in 1996, Ronald Reagan was overruled by Congress when he vetoed economic sanctions on South Africa in response to its apartheid policies. Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress was demeaned as communists and terrorists. This, of course, was supposedly during the Cold War. That's part of the reason why they were branded that way. So this brings up the other part involving the Nazi saluting apartheid baby, who is complaining that South Africa doesn't want his satellite business there because he's not black. South Africa has refuted the apartheid baby's claim by noting that he's not applied for the appropriate licensing in his native country. In fact, this is an actual quote. Sir, that is not true, and you know it. It's got nothing to do with your skin color. Starlink is welcome to operate in South Africa provided there's compliance with local laws. This is a global international trade and investment principle, replied Clayson Monyela, an official in the South African government. The apartheid baby doesn't like that South Africa's initiatives also include that 30% of a company's ownership in their local subsidiaries should be represented by historically disadvantaged groups. So this goes farther because that means that there's other areas of compliance that must be met in order for the apartheid baby to apply for licensing. How then does this apply to the United States? Well, under the current administration, it's making every effort to do away with initiatives and measures that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in all facets of life. And those who support diversity, equity, and inclusion are being vilified as Marxist and radical. Now, you see how familiar this sounds? Such practices, they argue, are discriminatory. So what they're doing is using the current law to dismantle what has been progressive. They're pushing this narrative by dismantling agencies, departments, and programs executively through executive orders and by laying off and firing federal workers, financially by cutting off funding and forcing individuals, institutions, and businesses to comply with their agenda or their directives. And what we're also seeing is really a thinly veiled attempt at instituting apartheid in the United States, both legislatively and legally. So that's all I have to share in this installment. Look for future installments in this social media.